Welcome, everyone. I hope we have all arrived. Jane, do you have words for us for welcome? I'm going to open a couple more doors.
Welcome, everyone. Those here in Fogelson Hall and those joining us from your homes or wherever you may be. Through the gift of live stream, welcome.
Hey, good to see you.
I am Jane King. I use she, her pronouns, and I am honored to serve today as your worship associate.
Okay. Friends, the chime got forgotten today, so we are starting.
We are grateful for our dedicated tech team, Michael and Jim.
So friends, the service is starting.
For our guest speaker, John Lehman. For our musical talent, Lydia Madrick at the piano and Steve Pollard on guitar.
And Susie George.
And Susie George, excuse me. We appreciate the steady behind-the-scenes work of Erin and Mary in the office and the quiet presence of our safety team, who remain outside so that we can feel secure within these walls. We are also grateful for those who arrive early to prepare coffee and set out refreshments. For Elizabeth and all our greeters, who extend the first welcome as you enter, and for each of you, those whose presence helps weave the fabric of this beloved gathering. Welcome. Our opening song is number 361 in the Gray Book.
Seated. Thank you, friends. I have three very short readings as our opening words. The first is from Christian Wyman. Jürgen Mortman says compassion is the other side of the living joy. So that on the other side of a joy, if it's a true joy, then you're alert to the fact that the world is not usually like that. And other lives are not usually like that. And so you're motivated to return to the world in order to try and make it like that for others, to rescue the world for the sake of joy. That's the first one. The second one is from Roshi Joan Halifax up at Upaya. One of the ways that Buddhists share sympathetic joy is to dedicate the merit of whatever good has arisen in their lives to the well-being of others. At the end of a session of meditation, we say, may the merit of this practice penetrate into each thing in all the realms, and may it benefit all beings. And the third is from Gretchen Rubin. One of the best ways to make yourself happy is to make other people happy. One of the best ways to make other people happy is to be happy yourself. All right, let's see. Whoops, I need the matches. It's all right. It's all that meditation.
The spark of love resides in all of us. We are free to act from it or not. If we choose love, how will love shape what we do? If we choose love, how will it improve our actions? If we choose love, how will I treat those around me? If I choose love, will I find it when life gets hard? If I choose love, will you also choose love? Love begets love, and it is love that lights our chalice. A poem by Anastasia Birosh.
So we continue with, is this the last pledge testimonial? Or do we have one more? At least one more. Okay. So I'm going to just put this here for when it's time for Joseph's house. And I'm going to invite John up.
Thank you. For those who don't know me, my name is John Lehman, and I'm wearing multiple hats this morning. I started out with the tech team, and now I'm a member of the Pledge Committee, and as of less than 2 weeks ago, I find myself acting vice president for finance. And thirdly, later on in the service, I will be switching hats yet again and speaking as a retired professor of Chinese philosophy on Buddhism. So maybe it was professionally schizophrenic and not just wearing multiple hats. But at any rate, here's the summary information on the pledge drive. Thank you all who have contributed. So far, we have raised over 70% of our final goal. $248,000 of our goal of $350. 157 people have pledged so far. That would be for those of us who give as a family. So we're doing very well. Again, thank you all who have contributed. For those who have not yet contributed, we will greatly appreciate your upcoming contributions. The drive isn't quite over, and we look forward to pledges from the rest of you, both members and friends. I should point out, by the way, that I have been finding myself the finance guy, often with very short notice, for nonprofits for over 40 years now. And this is one of the most, no, I take that back. This is the most cost-effective nonprofit I have ever done this for. I am incredulous at how few financial resources the UU Church uses to do everything we do. We don't have a final budget for this next year yet, but based on prior year's budget, by far our largest expense is salaries and benefits for our very small staff. Other than Reverend Gale, you can count them on the fingers of one hand. By the way, the pledges just about pay for the staff, salaries and benefits. Our next biggest expense, which is significantly lower, is the building. Any of you who are homeowners know all about maintenance. The cost of the building is, or maintaining the building, is paid in large part by rent from the various organizations that use it. And the rest comes from what we make from events and so forth. And the rest of our expenses, well, none of the categories are particularly high because there are so many volunteers. And again, I want to thank all of the volunteers who basically make this place work. So again, thank you all for your contributions. Thank you equally or more so for all of the things you do non-financially to help us. And with that, we'll hopefully make this the shortest of the various pledge testimonials. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jack.
Grab your coat and get your hat. Leave your worries on my doorstep. Just direct your feet to the sunny side of the street. Can't you hear a pitter-pat? Oh, and a happy tune is your step. Life can be oh so sweet on the sunny side of the street. I used to walk in the shade with those blues on parade. But I'm not afraid, no, this rover has crossed over. If I never had a cent, I'd be rich as all those billionaires. Gold dust at my feet on the sunny side of the street.
All right. So our theme for the month of April is joy. And, oh dear, that was a little scary. Here are some other bits and pieces, my friend.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Whew. So our theme for the month is joy, and our theme today is sympathetic joy, which is one of the 4 Brahma Viharas from Buddhism. Now, there are at least two different stories about why the Buddha created the Brahma Viharas. One of them says that Buddha talked to a group of Brahmins and said, you know, if you do this, then you're going to be reborn as a lower level god on your way to enlightenment. The more interesting story focuses on loving kindness. So this is from the post-canonical Sutta Nipata commentary, which is the background for the Metta Sutra. So the Buddha was staying at Savatthi with a band of monks, and they had received the subjects for their meditation, and they went to the forest to spend the rainy season. Now, there were deities inhabiting the trees in this forest, and because it was the rainy season, they had to come down out of the treetops and dwell on the ground, okay? Presumably because of the wind and the lightning and the storms. And they were a little worried by the arrival of all these monks in their forest, and they hoped that they would leave soon. And when they discovered that that wasn't the plan, that the monks were going to stay in their forest for the duration of the rainy season, they decided that they needed to encourage them to move along. And so they started tormenting the monks in little ways. And we don't have a description of this, but of course, in the dark, strange noises, little pinches and pokes and things falling on you. And pretty soon, the monks found that they were not able to sleep, nor were they able to meditate, and even living was kind of difficult. And so they went back to the Buddha and they told him what was going on. And then the Buddha instructed them in the Metta Sutra and advised them to return to the forest and practice loving kindness. So engage in this new form of meditation. And an amazing thing happened. Those tree deities calmed down. Their restlessness abated. The monks' restlessness abated. Everybody stopped being reactive and started responding from their center. The meditation manuals from a few hundred years after the Buddha's death, which are the meditation manuals still in use today, use this story to introduce the idea that the 4 Brahma Viharas, which John's going to talk about, overcome negative emotions. It makes it a very useful story and a very useful series of practices for this time in which we live. John?
Before I start, I should mention a recommended book for everybody, which is not so much on Buddhism as a book entitled Buddhist Voices in Unitarian Universalism, which describes how Unitarians have basically incorporated Buddhism for 180 years and how universalism incorporated it even more. So as a long practicing Buddhist, becoming a Unitarian didn't seem to be particularly unusual or difficult, or it just worked out. So the Brahmaviharas in English are probably best translated as the immeasurables. They are metta, loving kindness, karuna, compassion, mudita, sympathetic joy, and upekkha, equanimity. And since I suspect that there is only one Pali speaker in the room, I will use only English from now on. These are very important in the teaching of meditation. Not because they are the goal of meditation, but because they help do it properly. To take the 30 million words in the Buddhist sutras and commentaries and summarize them in 3 sentences, life is unsatisfactory because things are not the way we wish they were. And there is an 8-step process to fix that. These 4 immeasurables are basically part of the 6th step. The 7th step is mindfulness, which you've all heard of, and the 8th is concentration. Now, in the Buddhist day, since inheriting traditional Indian thought, everybody believed in rebirth, the assumption was that achieving enlightenment, getting rid of your dissatisfaction, would take several lifetimes. Modern Americans figure we ought to be able to do it in about an hour. As evidence for which, Friday, a local medical group asked me to please spend an hour teaching them all how to master mindfulness. Now, if I hadn't had a doctor's appointment at the time, I could have taught them how to do mindfulness, but they wouldn't have been successful. Because as those of you know who try to meditate, what the Chinese call your monkey mind continuously interrupts you. And a lot of this interruption is through negative mental states. And so the 4 immeasurables were developed to do 2 things. Number 1, loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity are good in and of themselves. But more importantly, they help you get rid of negative emotions, more or less automatically. The negative emotions that we're talking about are, number 1, different varieties of aversion. This would mean hate, resentment, anger, fear, basically what happens when you watch television. Secondly, greed and envy, which is essentially the basis of our lifestyle. And lastly, negativity and boredom. So the solution is to cultivate the first 3 immeasurables: loving kindness, compassion, and sympathetic joy, in order to build joy. Equanimity passes beyond joy, and we'll talk extensively about equanimity next month, because this month we're doing joy. So let us talk about the general procedure for all of these, and then we'll talk about loving kindness and compassion over the next few minutes. And then later on in the service, for the second homily, will focus on sympathetic joy, which is by far the hardest of the first three. So the general procedure for all four: you concentrate on developing this quality with respect to different people. And you start with yourself. Because, for example, feeling loving kindness towards yourself, for many of us, doesn't come naturally. After yourself, you start with people that are close to you that you like. And then more distant friends, people to whom you are indifferent, maybe clerks in a store, people that you dislike, and then people that you really dislike. I started doing this seriously very soon after I got appointed as a university dean in charge of making major budget cuts, which meant that I was the least popular person among anybody in the school, but decided I needed to stay positive. So I practiced this towards all of the people who were calling for me to be burned at the stake. And it worked. So basically, with loving kindness, you start with, may so-and-so be happy. And you meditate on this. And you visualize the person in question as being happy. May so-and-so be free of cares, and so forth. And so you practice this with yourself, with someone you like well, with a regular friend, and you keep going until you find somebody that you intensely dislike. Maybe even more than I dislike some of the professional complainers on the faculty. Maybe even some politicians. You do basically the same thing with compassion, except that instead of wishing that the person may be happy, free of cares, and so forth, if the person is unhappy, you attempt to essentially put yourself in their shoes and share their unhappiness. You probably won't have too much difficulty finding people who are unhappy for whom you can be compassionate. And again, you practice this. You start with yourself, and then you go to close friends and extend it until you run into somebody that you like less well. And I'll give a real-world example here. There are a number of people in my immediate family who suffer from what used to be called Asperger's syndrome. Now we would refer to this as very intelligent people who are on the autism spectrum. These are not people that, these are not people you would want to be. And so I've never had particular difficulty being compassionate for my relatives who suffer from this. Elon Musk is a little more difficult, but a reasonable target, because again, the goal is to make me happy and to avoid aversion for loving kindness and compassion. And for sympathetic joy, we're going to combat greed and envy. And that's done basically the same thing, and more details coming up relatively soon.
The song is called I Have Decided to Generate Joy.
have decided to generate joy. I have decided to generate joy. I have decided. I have decided. I have decided to generate joy in my heart. Joy, sweet joy in my heart. I have decided to act with love. I have decided to act with love. I have decided. I have decided. I have decided to act with love in my heart. Love, sweet love in my heart. I have decided to live in peace. I have decided to live in peace. I have decided. I have decided. I have decided to live in peace in my heart. Peace, sweet peace in my heart. All right, you guys ready to sing? I've decided to generate joy. Ready? 2, 3, 4. I have decided to generate joy. Yeah, that's it. I have decided to generate joy. I have decided. I have decided. I have decided to generate joy in my heart. Joy, sweet joy in my heart. Let's do it again. Let's generate joy. I have decided to generate joy. I have decided to generate joy. I have decided. I have decided. I have decided to generate joy. Where? In my heart. Joy, sweet joy in my heart. In my heart. Joy, sweet joy in my heart.
Our stones of conscience. Remembering. Each Sunday, we place 4 stones in our chalice to help us remember. The mountain rock reminds us that the land where we gather, called in Tewa Ogap Oge, is the ancestral homeland of Tewa-speaking peoples. Across the generations, and our presence here is burdened with a complex history. The geode reminds us that violence is endemic in our world and the struggle to create peace is unending. The third stone, from the mountains behind Santa Fe, with fossils embedded in it, reminds us that this place was once the floor of an ocean and climate change is real. The fourth stone reminds us that freedom is precious and democracy is hard work. None of these challenges will be resolved unless we and other good-hearted people around the world work to unravel racism, mend generational patterns of violence, and learn to live peacefully and regeneratively on our planet.
So we set aside a time most Sunday mornings for the sharing of our sorrows and joys, knowing that joys that are shared are multiplied and sorrows that are shared are easier to carry. We have a sorrow from Ann Morgan, a former member of our congregation, a dear friend of mine. George Flores died on March 15th. His life was one of service to others, both his profession, in his profession and in retirement. His last assignment with USAID was as mission director in Yemen. As his obituary said, his kind and gentle spirit will remain with us. And we have a joy. Mary Ellen writes, "Joy, oh joy, Mim Chapman is home after surgery and is doing well." We have a sorrow from Gail Applegate, who wrote last week, "My brother's wife, Pat, has lung cancer, and it has spread. She is in a Madison nursing home. She's stopped eating and drinking. She's depressed. She's ready to die." Our hearts go out to Pat and to Jim and to Gail and to everyone who loves Pat. We have a joy from Gail Boyd. "I'm so happy to be back with you all this morning, and your wonderful cards were a great comfort while I was ill. I keep rereading them." We have birthdays. Cheryl Fossum Graham, Ann Jennings Reed, Donna Durham, Marilyn Barnes, and Chris Meckles are all celebrating birthdays this week. Happy birthday to all of you. So we sort of do the reverse here. We don't have little people to celebrate, very young people whose birthdays are celebrated. So once you reach a certain age, we celebrate your birthday. And if you want your birthday celebrated sooner, you can talk to Elizabeth and she'll add you to the roster. Speaking of which, there's a birthday card on the table in the foyer for George Simon. He will be turning 91 next week. Please stop by and sign the card and wish him a happy birthday. We have visitors this morning, which is a great joy. One of the lovely things about being in Santa Fe is so many people come to visit. If you are visiting and you are willing, raise your hand and wave when I call your name. If you are not an extrovert, that is all right, but we might still say hello to you over coffee. Robert Reynolds, welcome. Renee Denton from Pecos, Renee. And Zanaya, all right. Nice to meet you, Zanaya. Deborah Hughes, Deborah, welcome. Morgan and Kristen, welcome. And Amy from Washington, D.C., welcome. All right, so if you would light one more candle for the joys and the sorrows we have heard, and for the joys and the sorrows we carry as yet unspoken in our hearts. And we're going to sing Spirit of Life. If you need the words, it's 1, 2, 3 in the gray hymnal, or you can just kind of follow along or listen. Resting now on the echoes of the music, let's enter a few minutes of quiet and contemplation. I invite you to close your eyes if that's comfortable for you. Take a deep breath, and as you exhale, let your body relax. Let your thoughts drift. Feel your heart begin to soften and open. Let it unfold so that it can contain all of the sorrows and joys, all of the worries and cares, all of the possibilities and hopes that are moving through our days and our lives in these challenging times. Breathe. And as you relax into the quiet, I invite you to remember that you do not have to carry those sorrows, those joys, those worries all by yourself. When we sit together in this space, we know that we are not alone. And so I invite you to let yourself become aware of the people around you and of the respect and affection that connect you to one another, that connect us to one another, and to those who are watching online, and to those who are traveling, and to those who abide in our hearts. Breathe. Rest in this safe and spacious place. And in the spirit of the day, I invite you to say to yourself, or to echo my words in your own mind, may I be joyful. May my happiness increase. May my good fortune and the causes for your joy and happiness increase. May you be joyful. May your happiness increase. May your good fortune and the causes for your joy and your happiness abound. You are welcome to extend this to whoever you wish in the next few moments of quiet and in the music that follows.
boundless goodwill. Let us cultivate boundless goodwill. Let none deceive another or despise any being in any state. Let none in anger or ill will wish another harm. Even as a mother watches over her child, so with boundless mind should one cherish all living beings, radiating friendliness over the whole world, above, below, and all around, without limit.
On to sympathetic joy. Joy is, of course, something all of us wish for ourselves. Wishing for joy for other people turns out to be a little bit complicated at times. So that wishing joy to the world is fairly easy. We do that every December. Being joyful when somebody else is may be easy or may be extraordinarily difficult, which is why it's the third of the four immeasurables and the last one that involves joy. Since, as I said before, equanimity leaves joy behind. The definition is pretty short. Basically, sympathetic joy means that you're happy that somebody else is happy. You're glad that they're glad. So happiness for someone else. And again, we practice doing this from ourself, which, unlike loving kindness, seems to be fairly easy for most people, through good friends, and so forth. And once you get past the good friends, it starts to get difficult. And the difficulty is that if you want to be sincerely happy for someone, glad that they are happy, you can't be envious of the reason that they are happy. And of course, that's very often the case for various reasons. So basically, sympathetic joy is important not only because it's very good in and of itself, but because it's a difficult but effective weapon against greed and envy. If we're really going to be happy for somebody else, we can't wish that what had happened to them was happening to us and not to them. And from the reactions, clearly, this is a common emotion. Let's take a couple of typical examples. For people who are working, when somebody else gets promoted, how happy are you for them? And that's going to vary based on where you work. If you are a professional in law or in consulting or in accounting or a tenure-track faculty member, areas where a minority of the employees actually get promoted to the level where they're allowed to stay. When your colleagues get promoted, that's not necessarily something you're going to rejoice at, unless you're already at that partnership level. Because basically, they got promoted and you didn't. Practicing sympathetic joy You should be able to develop sincere happiness that they got promoted. Similarly, weddings. Are you happy for the people at weddings, for the bride and groom? No matter how big or how simple the ceremony is. Some of us, of course, don't pay much attention to this. My wife and I turned down our family's offer of a big wedding and got married in court. And so we've never been jealous of anybody else's wedding. Ours has lasted 50-some years, after all. But people who do destination weddings in Paris, well, maybe we wouldn't feel quite so happy for them. We could use retirement as a similar example. Are you happy for your colleagues who take early retirement in their 30s or 40s? I read yesterday of somebody who's doing it in his 20s. So we may or may not be happy for our friends or colleagues who retire, especially if they retire early. And we could come up with a fairly long list of other things that people find really exciting for themselves, and we really wish it was happening to us instead. And so one of the great benefits of actively practicing sympathetic joy as part of meditation is to get over that, to learn to be really happy for other people, even if what's happening to them isn't happening to us. And the more we get rid of greed and envy, the calmer and happier we're going to be. And that transitions into equanimity, the fourth of the four immeasurables that we're going to talk about next time, where we leave joy behind, because if we're trying to be mindful of what's going on and meditate and generally become enlightened, best not to be disturbed even by joy. Buddhism, unlike many other systems of thought, puts a great deal of emphasis on equanimity and calm and not being excited about things. And so one of the questions that we're going to talk about next month when we talk about equanimity is, what is the difference between equanimity and indifference? And one of the major cultural differences between Buddhism and, say, Christianity is that while Buddhism strongly suggests that you will personally be better off if you work to improve the world, you should do so from a mental state of equanimity. Righteous anger is something to avoid like the plague. So next month, we'll talk about equanimity, and a challenge for all of you in developing sympathetic joy is this June, Jeff Bezos, the head of Amazon, and his fiancée, Lauren Sanchez, are going to get married. See if you can be happy for them.
This song has given me lots of joy, and that I wrote it, and it used to be my song, and I played it for church here on several occasions, and you've all written some words for it, which changes it from my song to our song, or your song, and so please join in. Life is good and sharing with your friends. I say life is good and sharing with your friends. Life is good and sharing
Life is good, you share it with your friends. You share your highs, you share your lows. You share your friends and forgive your foes. So life is good when you share it with your friends. Life is good when you share it with your friends. Life oh so good. Life is oh so good. Life is good when you share it with your friends. Share your friends. You share your highs, you share your lows. Share your friends and forgive your foes. Life is good, share it with your friends. Life is good, share it with your friends. You share your tools and you share your toys. You share your sorrows, you share your joys. Life is good, you share it with your friends. Life is good, you share it with your friends. So life is so good. Yeah, life is oh so good. Life is good when you share it with your friends. Life is oh so good. I said life is oh so good. Life is good when you share it with your friends.
Extinguishing our chalice and closing words. So hold on. Go ahead.
I have one short announcement.
Oh, yeah. that
Next
too.
Sunday, our visual theme for the Earth Day Easter service will be nests. If you have a nest you would like to share, you are invited to bring it Sunday for display on the chancel table. Like our own UU community, nests are interwoven symbols of life, sanctuary, and nurturance. Now a poem by Mary Oliver. Don't hesitate. If you suddenly and unexpectedly feel joy, don't hesitate. Give into it. There are plenty of lives and whole towns destroyed or about to be. We are not wise and not very often kind, and much can never be redeemed. Still, life has some possibility left. Perhaps this is its way of fighting back, that sometimes something happens better than all the riches or power in the world. It could be anything, but very likely you notice it in the instant when love begins. Anyway, that's often the case. Anyway, whatever it is, don't be afraid of its plenty. Joy is not made to be a crumb.
Thank you, Jane. So 2 quick announcements. They're woven through the service today. First, if you missed the last Hands Off rally, there's another one coming up next Saturday. And Jim Aspero is happy to meet people here at UU Santa Fe at 11:15 to walk down to the Roundhouse if you're a walker. We encourage you to get there early if you're someone who needs to drive and find a place to park. And I just wanted folks to know, we have 2 wheelchairs here that you are welcome to borrow. They collapse, they can go in the back of someone's car if there is someone who would like to participate but is not going to be able to walk very far or not going to be comfortable standing. So let's take care of each other and let's speak out. The other opportunity for you is an Earth Day opportunity. Dominique Mazot, who is a member of our community, is doing a wonderful ritual piece called Tears for the Children of the Earth. It will be in the plaza on Earth Day, starting at 10:30 and running till 3. You are invited to join Dominique and to hold the bowl of tears as part of the observance. So, with that all said, thank you so much for your patience, friends. Grab hands with someone seated near you, and let's do our hand-holding benediction. Please repeat after me. May love and skill be in our hands. May love and courage fill our hearts. May love and wisdom light our minds. May love move through us and walk among us. As we live our lives and work to heal our world. Amen, shalom, namaste, blessed be. Assalamu alaikum, ashe, aho. Have a wonderful afternoon, friends. Thank you for joining us today, friends. We hope that you enjoyed today's service. Please take a little time and explore our website and visit our online welcome table if you'd like to know more about us. Otherwise, we'll see you next Sunday morning. Stay in touch and be well.